The wind was a constant sculptor on the high plateau, a relentless artist carving away at stone and spirit. On the 15th day of the 9th month in the year 765 CE, it carried the first hint of the coming winter, a blade-sharp chill that promised an end to the brief, glorious summer. From his vantage point on a rocky outcrop, Tenzin, a young monk barely 20 years of age, watched the last of the sun's rays paint the distant snow-dusted peaks in hues of incandescent orange and deep violet. Below him, nestled in a shallow basin at nearly 15,000 feet, the fledgling monastery of Sami was a testament to a grand vision, yet it seemed to shrink under the immensity of the bruised purple sky. The great king Trisong Detsen, a ruler driven by a fervent desire to plant the seed of Dharma in the heart of his empire, had decreed its construction in 762 CE. It was to be a mandala in stone and wood, a cosmic diagram meant to be the heart of Buddhism in the Tibetan Empire. But as Tenzin pulled his coarse woolen robe tighter, a familiar dread, cold and heavy as a river stone, settled in his stomach. The vision was divine, but the reality was brutal. The previous winter, their first at this staggering altitude, had been a protracted lesson in suffering. They had arrived on a wave of religious fervor in the spring of 764 CE, their spirits as high as the peaks that surrounded them. The king himself had visited the site on the 10th day of the 4th month, his presence a blessing and a command, his retinue a vibrant splash of color against the muted tones of the landscape. They had worked tirelessly through the short, intense summer, quarrying the dark, heavy stone from the surrounding mountains, a process that left their hands raw and their bodies aching. They felled the precious few trees in the lower valleys, their axes echoing in the thin air, and raised the first of the residential halls. They built as their ancestors had for centuries, with thick stone walls and small, high windows designed to keep out the elements. But the cold of the Tibetan plateau was an element unlike any other. It was a physical presence, a relentless, invisible thief that stole the warmth from their fires and the very breath from their lungs. By the 11th month of 764 CE, the first heavy snows had fallen, and the monastery became a prison of ice. The wind, a constant shrieking gale that the elders called the mountain's breath, found every imperfection in their masonry, every tiny gap in the clay mortar. The cold radiated inward from the stone walls, a damp, penetrating chill that no amount of yak-dung fire could dispel. The smoke from the fires hung heavy in the unventilated halls, stinging their eyes and coating their throats with soot. The monks huddled together in the main hall, their chanted prayers turning to desperate, whispered pleas for survival. The thin air, a consequence of the hypobaric hypoxia they were only beginning to understand, made every breath a conscious labor. Many fell ill with the mountain sickness, their bodies racked with debilitating coughs and fevers, their minds clouded with a persistent, dull headache. By the time the spring thaw finally arrived in the 3rd month of 765 CE, 5 of their brethren had perished, their bodies interred in the frozen ground, a stark and early sacrifice to the king's grand vision. Now, the cruel cycle was beginning anew. The signs were unmistakable, written in the language of the land for anyone who cared to read them. The marmots, usually active until the first snows, had disappeared into their burrows a month early, on the 20th day of the 8th month. The hardy alpine flowers, which had bloomed with such defiant beauty, had withered overnight after a sudden sharp frost on the first day of the 9th month. Tenzin had spent the preceding weeks inspecting the new residential block, his fingers tracing the lines of clay mortar between the massive stones. The master builder, A stern traditionalist monk named Lobsang, whose face seemed carved from the same unyielding granite as the mountains, had overseen the work with an iron fist. He was a man of immense skill and even greater pride, insisting on the time-honored methods passed down through generations. "Our walls are 3 feet thick," Lobsang had declared on the 5th day of the 9th month, his voice booming with unshakable confidence as he addressed the younger monks. "They are a fortress against the sky. What more can be done? The Dharma requires fortitude, not comfort." Tenzin, however, was not so sure. He was a student of observation, his mind as keen and clear as the mountain air. He had spent countless hours watching the sun's journey across the sky, its path a high, brilliant arc that seemed to mock the cold shadows in the valleys. He had noticed how the south-facing cliffs remained free of snow long after the others were buried. He had felt the warmth radiating from a dark stone, a pleasant surprise to his cold hands, long after the sun had dipped below the horizon. He saw the sun not as a distant, divine entity, but as a source of immense and untapped power, a furnace in the sky. An idea, radical and bordering on heretical, had begun to form in his mind. What if they didn't fight the sun, but invited it in? What if they could trap its warmth within their walls? He had tried to speak to Lobsang about it on the 18th day of the 9th month, catching the master builder as he inspected a newly laid foundation. Tenzin gestured towards the sun-drenched southern face of the valley. "Master, the sun's heat is a gift. We close our walls to it, but what if we were to welcome it? What if we made larger openings to the south, to let the light and warmth inside?" Lobsang had stopped, turning to face Tenzin with a look of incredulous disdain. "Openings? You want to punch holes in our fortress, and let in the wind and the demons that ride upon it? You are a boy, Tenzin. You have read too many scrolls and laid too few stones. You think of comfort, I think of survival. We build as our fathers did. It is the only way." The rebuke, delivered in front of the other apprentices, stung, but it did not extinguish the spark of Tenzin's idea. On the 20th day of the 9th month, he sought out the monastery's abbot, the great master Shantarakshita, who had come from the warm plains of India at the king's request. The abbot, a man of profound wisdom and quiet contemplation, was in the process of translating a Sanskrit sutra, his brush moving with a fluid grace. He listened patiently as Tenzin, his voice trembling slightly, explained his theory. He spoke of the sun's path, of the heat-retaining properties of the dark stone, of the possibility of creating a dwelling that warmed itself. He did not speak of comfort, but of life. He spoke of reducing the need for precious fuel, of creating a healthier environment where the monks could study and pray without the constant debilitating threat of frost breath. Shantarakshita, his eyes thoughtful, did not dismiss him. Instead, he led Tenzin to a quiet corner of the partially built library where scrolls of astronomical charts and mathematical treatises were stored. "The path of the sun is not a mystery but a science," the abbot said, his voice gentle. "The scholars of Nalanda have studied it for generations. Your observations are astute, young Tenzin, but they are only the beginning. An idea without a plan is but a dream." He unrolled a chart showing the celestial spheres, its intricate diagrams a map of the cosmos. He granted Tenzin a small concession, a single small cell at the end of the new residential block, a space deemed undesirable due to its exposed location. "Build it as you see fit," the abbot declared on the 22nd day of the 9th month. "Show us if this dream can be made of stone." Tenzin was elated. He had been given a chance, a small canvas on which to paint his grand vision, but his excitement was tempered by the immense challenge that lay before him. He was no master builder, He had only his observations, his intuition, and a handful of astronomical charts he barely understood. Lobsang and the other builders watched him with a mixture of pity and scorn as he began to clear his small plot. "The boy will build a house of wind," Lobsang scoffed to his men on the 25th day of the 9th month. "The winter will be his teacher, a harsh one." As the first snowflakes of the season began to fall on the first day of the 10th month, swirling in the air like restless spirits, Tenzin stood before his allotted space. He had his stone, his clay, and his radical idea. He was about to defy centuries of tradition, to challenge the very foundations of their architecture. The wind howled around him, a chorus of doubt and derision. The weight of expectation and the looming threat of the winter settled upon his young shoulders. His experiment was not just about building a better room. It was a battle for a new kind of wisdom, a struggle to prove that survival on the roof of the world depended not just on enduring the elements, but on understanding and embracing them. The first stone had yet to be laid, but the foundation of a revolution was already being set. Part 2. Tenzin began his work on the 3rd day of the 10th month, a solitary figure against the backdrop of the colossal monastery construction. His small, designated cell felt like an island of defiant innovation in a sea of rigid tradition. Lobsang's crew worked with a percussive, rhythmic efficiency, their hammers and chisels shaping the massive stones for the main temple, their synchronized chants a prayer to the mountain gods for strength and stability. They ignored Tenzin, their silence a form of judgment more potent than any words. But Tenzin was not deterred. He had the abbot's blessing and a burning conviction that felt like a small sun in his own chest. His first decision was the most radical, a clear break from the architectural dogma of his time. Instead of the small slit-like windows set high in the walls like the eyes of a fortress, he planned for a large, south-facing opening that would dominate the cell's facade. He spent 2 full days, from the 4th to the 5th of the 10th month, meticulously studying the sun's path. He drove a wooden stake into the ground, a simple gnomon, and marked the progression of its shadow from dawn until dusk. He consulted the abbot's charts, cross-referencing his own crude measurements with the precise calculations of the Indian astronomers. He needed to find the optimal angle for his window, one that would capture the low-hanging winter sun but be shaded from the high, intense sun of summer. He knew the opening would be a source of heat loss at night, a gaping vulnerability that Lobsang would be quick to point out. His solution was as simple as it was ingenious: a heavy, insulated shutter made from 2 layers of precious wood packed with a dense mixture of dried moss and yak hair. It would be a primitive form of double glazing, a movable wall designed to trap the day's heat during the long, frigid nights. Next, he turned his attention to the walls. Lobsang's fortress-like structures were designed for sheer mass, a brute force approach to insulation. But Tenzin understood that mass alone was not enough. The heat needed to be stored and released effectively, like a slow, steady breath. He became a student of stone, spending days searching the quarry for the darkest specimens, rocks with a high iron content that felt heavier in his hand and glowed with a deep, residual warmth after a day in the sun. He laid these stones on the interior of the south wall with a painstaking precision, ensuring the tightest possible fit. He used a thicker mixture of clay and pebbles as mortar, a dense, cohesive material that would minimize air leakage. This was not just masonry, it was thermal engineering in its most nascent form. On the 10th day of the 10th month, he began construction of the floor, an element that most builders considered an afterthought. Traditional Tibetan homes had simple packed earth floors which were perpetually cold and drew warmth from the body. Tenzin, however, had a different idea, inspired by the way the air seemed to shimmer above the sun-baked rocks. He excavated the floor of his cell to a depth of 2 feet, a back-breaking task that took him 3 full days of solitary labor. In the pit, he laid a bed of large, flat river stones, creating a hollow space, a plenum, beneath the floor. He then laid a second layer of his carefully selected dark flagstones on top, their surfaces polished smooth with sand and water. His theory was that the sun, streaming through the large southern window, would heat the flagstones. This heat would then radiate downwards, warming the air trapped in the hollow space below. This trapped heated air would then provide a continuous gentle source of radiant heat throughout the night, turning the entire floor into a giant, slow-release radiator. It was a rudimentary form of a hypocaust system, an idea that had been used by the Romans, but which Tenzin had arrived at through pure observation and intuition. By the 20th day of the 10th month, the cell was beginning to take shape. The south-facing wall was a mosaic of dark, heat-absorbing stone, the large window opening a gaping maw that seemed to drink in the pale autumn sunlight. The floor was a smooth, dark expanse, cool to the touch, but pregnant with the promise of warmth. Lobsang, making his rounds, paused to inspect Tenzin's work, his shadow falling over the young monk. He ran a skeptical hand over the polished floor, his brow furrowed in disapproval. "A floor of cold stone," he grumbled on the 21st day, his voice loud enough for the other apprentices to hear. "You will freeze in your sleep, boy, and this hole in the wall, you are building a sieve, not a shelter. You bring shame on this holy endeavor." Tenzin did not argue. He simply bowed his head and continued his work. He built the north, east, and west walls with the thickest, most insulating stones he could find, minimizing the window openings on these faces to prevent heat loss. He paid special attention to the roof, using a double layer of timber and a thick blanket of packed earth and clay, ensuring it was perfectly sealed. He was creating a thermal envelope, a sealed box designed to capture and retain every precious degree of warmth. His most controversial innovation, however, was yet to come. On the 28th day of the 10th month, he began construction of what he called the sun space. It was a small glassless atrium, a semi-enclosed porch built onto the south-facing exterior of his cell. The walls were made of stone, but the roof was a simple wooden frame which he planned to cover with a translucent material. He had seen merchants from the south with bolts of a strange, thin fabric, silk, that shimmered in the light. He bartered his own meager rations for a small, damaged piece of the material, a precious commodity in this remote outpost. His plan was to stretch the fabric over the frame, creating a primitive greenhouse. The sun would heat the air trapped in the sun space, and this preheated air could then be vented into the main cell, providing an additional source of warmth. The sun space was the final straw for Lobsang. "A porch of cloth?" he roared on the 2nd day of the 11th month, his voice echoing through the construction site and causing work to grind to a halt. "Have you gone mad, Tenzin? The first storm will tear it to shreds. You are a disgrace to your craft and an insult to the spirits of this mountain." The other builders laughed, their mockery a chorus of derision. Tenzin's face burned with shame, but he held his ground, his jaw set with a quiet determination. He believed in his design, in the simple, elegant logic of his system. He completed the cell on the 10th day of the 11th month. It was a strange, unconventional structure, a hybrid of traditional Tibetan architecture and Tenzin's own radical ideas. The large south-facing window, the dark stone walls, the hollow floor, the audacious sun space. It was a building unlike any other on the plateau. The abbot, Shantarakshita, came to inspect his work. He ran a hand over the smooth, dark floor, his eyes taking in every detail. He did not praise Tenzin, nor did he criticize him. He simply said, "The winter will be the judge." The first true test came on the 15th day of the 11th month. A cold front swept down from the north, and the temperature plummeted to well below freezing. That night, Tenzin slept in his new cell for the first time. He sealed the insulated shutter over the large window, lit a single small butter lamp, and lay down on his simple wooden bed. The air in the cell was cool, but not cold. There was a gentle, almost imperceptible warmth radiating from the stone floor. He slept soundly, a feat he had not accomplished in months. The next morning he awoke to a world of white. A foot of snow had fallen overnight. He opened the shutter, and the morning sun, brilliant and intense in the thin, clear air, flooded the cell. The dark stone floor began to drink in the light, and within an hour the room was noticeably warmer. By midday the cell was comfortably warm, a small pocket of spring in the heart of the winter. He had done it. His system worked. But his triumph was short-lived. On the 20th day of the 11th month, a fierce blizzard descended upon the monastery, a swirling vortex of wind and snow that raged for 3 days. The wind, a relentless, probing force, tested every seam and joint of his construction. The sun space, Lobsang's object of ridicule, was battered by the gale. On the second night of the storm, Tenzin was awoken by a loud, violent tearing sound. His heart sank. Lobsang had been right. His house, of cloth, was no match for the fury of the plateau. The question was no longer whether his design worked in the sun, but whether it could survive the storm. The winter, it seemed, had delivered its judgment. Part 3. The sound of tearing silk was a death knell to Tenzin's hopes. He lay frozen on his cot, listening to the relentless assault of the blizzard, the wind howling like a hungry wolf outside his walls, a sound that seemed to mock his fragile creation. He had failed. Lobsang's scornful laughter echoed in his mind. He had built a house of dreams, and the harsh reality of the plateau had just ripped it to shreds. He spent the rest of the night in a state of despair, huddled under his thin blanket, convinced that the morning would reveal the complete destruction of his sun space, the most visible and audacious symbol of his failure. When the storm finally abated on the morning of the 23rd day of the 11th month, he forced himself to face the wreckage. He unsealed the heavy shutter and peered outside into a world of blinding white. The sun space was still standing. The wooden frame, which he had anchored deep into the stone walls, was intact. But the precious silk, a material meant for the robes of kings, not the roofs of houses, had been torn from its moorings, a tattered flag of defeat flapping in the wind. The small, enclosed space was now filled with a deep drift of snow. It was a ruin, a testament to his youthful arrogance. But as he stood there, surveying the damage, a strange thing happened. The sun, brilliant in the post-storm sky, began to work its magic. The rays, streaming into the now open sun space, struck the dark stone wall of his cell. The snow that was piled against the wall began to melt, the water trickling down the face of the stone. The air in the sun space, sheltered from the wind by the 3 remaining walls, began to warm up. It was not the superheated air he had envisioned, but it was a pocket of relative warmth, a buffer zone between the frigid outside world and his living quarters. He had failed to create a greenhouse, but he had accidentally created a highly effective solar air heater. The exposed stone wall was acting as a direct gain heat sink. He realized his mistake. The fabric had been too weak, too exposed, but the principle was sound. He needed a more robust material, something that could withstand the wind while still allowing the sun's light to pass through. His mind raced through the limited palette of materials available to him. Wood was too opaque. Glass was a substance of myth and legend, a treasure of the distant Roman Empire, not something to be found on the Tibetan plateau. Then his eyes fell upon a stack of discarded sheepskins near the monastery's kitchen, waiting to be tanned for parchment. The skins, when scraped thin and treated with oil, became translucent. They were used to cover small openings and to make drumheads. Why not a window? He spent the next week, from the 24th day of the 11th month to the first day of the 12th, experimenting with the sheepskins. It was a smelly, laborious process. He stretched them on wooden frames, scraped them with a sharp stone, and treated them with heated yak butter to make them more pliable and water-resistant. He built a new, stronger frame for his sun space, reinforcing it with extra timbers and using leather straps to lash the joints. On the second day of the 12th month, he stretched the treated skins over the frame, creating a tough, translucent membrane. It was not as clear as the southern silk, but it was strong, and it allowed a diffuse, golden light to pass through. The new, improved sun space was a revelation. The air inside heated up quickly, reaching a temperature that was a full 20 degrees warmer than the outside air by midday. He carved a small, closable vent between the sun space and his cell, allowing him to control the flow of warm air. His cell, already the warmest in the monastery, became a haven of comfort. The other monks, who had once scorned him, now looked at his creation with a mixture of envy and awe. They would find excuses to visit him, to bask for a few moments in the gentle, sun-drenched warmth. But Tenzin's innovation was about to face a new and far more dangerous challenge. On the 10th day of the 12th month, a series of earth tremors shook the region. The Tibetan plateau, the result of a colossal, slow-motion collision between two continents, was a seismically active area, a fact that the builders knew well. The traditional construction methods, with their thick, slightly inclined walls, were designed to withstand such shocks. But Tenzin's cell, with its large, unconventional window opening, was a structural anomaly. The south-facing wall, the very heart of his solar design, was also its greatest weakness. Lobsang, his face a mask of grim satisfaction, inspected Tenzin's cell after the first tremor. "Your hole in the wall has weakened the structure," he declared on the 11th day, his voice heavy with a somber authority. "The first real quake will bring it down upon your head. You have traded safety for comfort, boy. It is a fool's bargain." Tenzin, for the first time, felt a flicker of genuine doubt. Had he, in his quest for warmth, compromised the structural integrity of his building? Had he created a death trap? The answer came on the night of the 18th day of the 12th month. A powerful earthquake, the strongest in living memory, struck the monastery. The ground heaved and rolled, the sound of grinding rock a terrifying, subterranean roar that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. The monks, jolted from their sleep, rushed out into the snow-covered courtyard, their faces pale with terror in the moonlight. The main temple, Lobsang's masterpiece of traditional construction, swayed violently, a shower of stones raining down from its upper reaches. A section of the roof of the residential block, the very section where Tenzin's cell was located, collapsed with a deafening crash, sending a plume of dust and snow into the night air. Panic and chaos erupted in the courtyard. Monks were screaming, running in all directions, their prayers turning to cries of fear. Tenzin, his heart in his throat, stared at the collapsed section of the roof. His cell was gone, buried under a mountain of stone and earth. He had not just failed, his failure had caused a disaster. He had been so focused on the sun, on the cold, that he had ignored the most fundamental threat of all, the unstable, unpredictable earth beneath their feet. The abbot's words echoed in his mind, "The winter will be the judge." The winter had delivered its verdict, and it was a sentence of death and destruction. The cliffhanger was no longer about a single cell, but about the fate of the entire monastery and the crushing weight of Tenzin's guilt. Part 4. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, Tenzin stood frozen, the dust and the screams of the injured monks swirling around him in a nightmarish vortex. The collapsed roof was a gaping wound in the side of the residential hall, a stark monument to his hubris. He saw Lobsang, his face ashen in the moonlight, directing a frantic rescue effort, monks clawing at the rubble with their bare hands, their voices hoarse with desperation. The guilt was a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. His innovation, his beautiful sun-drenched dream, had become a tomb. Then, through the dust and the chaos, he heard a voice. "Tenzin, we are alive!" It was a faint, muffled cry, but it was unmistakable. It was coming from the rubble, from the very spot where his cell had been. A surge of adrenaline, of disbelief and desperate hope propelled him forward. He scrambled over the treacherous pile of fallen stones and earth, his hands tearing at the debris, his own safety forgotten. Other monks, hearing the cry, joined him, their movements now fueled by a renewed sense of purpose. They dug for what felt like hours, their fingers raw and bleeding, the frigid air burning their lungs. Finally, they broke through. And there, in a small, miraculously intact pocket of space, were two monks. They were bruised, terrified, but alive. They had been in the corridor outside Tenzin's cell when the roof had given way. The collapse had been devastating, but it had not been total. The south wall of Tenzin's cell, the wall with the great window, had held. The massive stone lintel he had insisted on placing above the window opening, a feature Lobsang had decried as a waste of time and material, had borne the brunt of the collapse, creating a small pocket of survival in the midst of the destruction. The rescue of the two monks, on the morning of the 19th day of the 12th month, was a moment of profound, almost mystical significance. Tenzin's cell had not been the cause of the collapse, it had been the source of their salvation. The very feature that Lobsang had identified as its greatest weakness had proven to be its greatest strength. The structural integrity of the lintel, combined with the slightly inward-sloping angle of the wall, a feature Tenzin had copied from traditional design, had created a structure that was both thermally efficient and seismically resilient. The earthquake, a terrible, destructive force, had become an unwitting and brutal test of his design, and his design had passed. The rest of the residential hall, built according to Lobsang's rigid traditional specifications, had suffered catastrophic damage. The walls, though thick, were too vertical, too rigid. They had cracked and crumbled under the strain. The roofs, heavy with earth and snow, had collapsed, killing 3 monks and injuring a dozen more. In the aftermath of the earthquake, the mood in the monastery was transformed. The scorn and derision that had been directed at Tenzin were replaced by a quiet, awestruck respect. Lobsang, his pride shattered, his confidence broken, came to Tenzin on the 20th day of the 12th month. He did not speak, but simply bowed his head, a gesture of profound and humble apology. It was a surrender, a concession that the old ways were not always the best ways, that wisdom could be found in the most unexpected of places. "Teach me," Lobsang whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Teach me how to build with the sun." The abbot, Shantarakshita, tasked Tenzin with leading the reconstruction of the monastery. It was an immense responsibility, a burden that weighed heavily on his young shoulders. But he was no longer the boy with a dream. He was a builder, a leader, a survivor. He had been tested by the elements, by the skepticism of his peers, and by the very earth beneath his feet, and he had emerged stronger, wiser. The reconstruction began on the first day of the first month of the new year, 766 CE. Tenzin, now working in close collaboration with a humbled and supportive Lobsang, redesigned the entire monastery based on the principles he had developed in his small experimental cell. They built with the sun in mind, orienting the buildings to the south, incorporating large, shuttered windows and sun spaces covered with translucent animal hides. They built with the earth in mind, using massive stone lintels and inclined walls to create structures that could withstand the tremors of the unstable land. They built with the cold in mind, using the principles of thermal mass and insulation to create homes that were warm, dry, and healthy. The new design was a synthesis of ancient wisdom and radical innovation, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The new monastery that rose from the ruins was a marvel of ingenuity and adaptation. The monks, who had once huddled in the cold, now lived in comfort and security, their days filled with study and prayer, their nights with a warmth that was both physical and spiritual. The incidence of frost breath and other respiratory ailments plummeted. The monastery, once a place of mere survival, became a true center of learning and enlightenment. The completion of the new Samai monastery, in the year 775 CE, was a moment of great celebration. King Trisong Detsen himself came to consecrate the new temple, his face a mixture of awe and gratitude. He saw in the monastery not just a building, but a symbol of the new Tibet he was trying to create, a nation that was both deeply rooted in its traditions and open to the winds of change. He honored Tenzin, the young monk who had dared to dream of a house warmed by the sun, with the title of Master of Light, a name that would be remembered in the annals of the monastery for centuries to come. The final cliffhanger was not one of survival, but of legacy. Tenzin had not just built a monastery, he had built a new way of life. The question was, would it last? Part 5. The principles of solar architecture pioneered by Tenzin at Sami Monastery did not remain confined to its hallowed walls. The monks who were trained there, who lived and studied in the sun-warmed halls, carried the knowledge with them as they spread out across the vast, wind-swept expanse of the Tibetan plateau, founding new monasteries and temples. The design, with its signature south-facing orientation, large glazed openings, and heavy thermal mass, became a hallmark of Tibetan monastic architecture for the next millennium. From the great monastic centers of Tashil Hunpo, founded in 1447, to the remote hermitages perched on snowbound peaks, the wisdom of Tenzin, the Master of Light, was replicated and refined, a golden thread woven into the very fabric of Tibetan culture. The techniques were adapted to local conditions and materials, but the core principles remained the same. In the agricultural valleys of the Yarlung Tsangpo, where timber was more plentiful, the sun spaces evolved into elaborate multi-story wooden balconies, their intricate lattice work a testament to the skill of the local craftsmen. In the nomadic regions of the north, the Changtang, where stone was scarce, the principles of solar orientation and thermal mass were applied to the design of the traditional yak hair tents, their dark, heat-absorbing fabric a low-tech but highly effective solar collector. The very layout of the nomadic camps often followed a solar logic, with the chieftain's tent occupying the warmest, most sun-exposed position. The legacy of Tenzin's innovation was not just architectural, it was cultural. The sun, which had always been an object of reverence in the animistic Bön religion that predated Buddhism in Tibet, was now integrated into the very fabric of daily life in a practical, tangible way. The sun space, or Nimakang, sunroom, became a central feature of the Tibetan home, a place for work, for socializing, and for spiritual practice. It was where the elderly would sit and spin their prayer wheels, their old bones warmed by the gentle heat. It was where the children would play during the long winter months, sheltered from the biting wind. It was a space that was both inside and outside, a bridge between the human world and the natural world. It was a physical manifestation of the Buddhist concept of interdependence, a recognition that human life was inextricably linked to the rhythms of the cosmos. The centuries that followed the construction of Sami were a golden age for Tibet. The empire expanded, the Buddhist teachings flourished, and a rich and vibrant culture developed in isolation behind the Himalayan wall. The solar-heated stone homes, which provided a level of comfort and security previously unknown on the plateau, were a crucial, if often overlooked, factor in this cultural efflorescence. They created a stable, healthy environment that allowed the arts and sciences to flourish. The great medical treatises, the profound philosophical texts, the intricate Thangka paintings, all were created in the warmth and light of these solar-powered sanctuaries. But the isolation that had protected and nurtured Tibetan culture for 1,000 years could not last forever. The 20th century brought with it a new and brutal set of challenges. The political upheavals of the 1950s resulted in the destruction of thousands of monasteries, the suppression of religious practice, and the erosion of traditional ways of life. The ancient knowledge, which had been passed down through an unbroken chain of masters and apprentices for over 1,000 years, was suddenly in danger of being lost forever. And yet the wisdom of Tenzin, the Master of Light, endured. It survived in the memories of the elderly, in the scattered texts that had been smuggled out of the country, and in the very stones of the ruined monasteries. And now, in the 21st century, it is undergoing a remarkable renaissance. As the world grapples with the challenges of climate change and resource depletion, architects and engineers are looking to traditional building systems for inspiration. The principles of passive solar design, which Tenzin had discovered through pure observation and intuition, are now at the cutting edge of sustainable architecture. The thick, heat-absorbing walls of the Tibetan longhouse are being reimagined as trombe walls, a modern passive solar heating technology that uses a glazed outer surface and a dark, massive inner wall to create a convective loop of warm air. The sun space, the humble Nimakang, is now a standard feature in energy-efficient homes around the world. The use of local natural materials, a necessity for Tenzin, is now a cornerstone of the green building movement. The story of the Tibetan monks and their solar-heated homes has become a parable for our time, a lesson in the enduring power of indigenous knowledge and the timeless wisdom of living in harmony with the sun. Tenzin's legacy is not just in the stones of Sami, but in every building that turns its face to the sun, in every design that seeks to work with nature rather than against it. He was a monk, a builder, a visionary. He lived and died over 1,000 years ago on the remote, wind-swept roof of the world. But his story, the story of how a simple monk used the power of the sun to defy the cold and build a new way of life, is a story that has never been more relevant. It is a story of hope, of ingenuity, and of the enduring light of human wisdom in the face of the darkest of challenges. The great temple of Sami still stands, its golden roofs gleaming in the high-altitude sun, a timeless monument to the boy who dared to build a house of light.